Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to join us for the 2024 Reflections Award ceremony. Um, I am Amani Freeman, the exhibitions manager for the Maryland Federation of Art. I'm joined here today by our wonderful juror, Miss Nicole Santiago. And we have Juliana Oakes, our gallery assistant, running point from the office. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Miss Santiago. She is a professor of art at William and Mary University. She holds a BFA in studio art from Indiana University and an MFA in painting from the University of New Hampshire. During her career, she is shown in nearly 140 group and solo exhibitions. She's currently affiliated with the First Street Gallery in New York City, New York, and a member of the Zuxis, a still life painting group. Her works have been published in several art publications, including the Artist Magazine, Art New England, INPA, the International Painting Annual, and Fine Art Connoisseur. She is a recipient of full fellowship residencies to the Studio Vermont Center in Johnson, Vermont, and the Ballygin Artist Foundation in Ballycastle, Ireland. Now I'm going to pass it off to Ms. Santiago if she has a few words to say about the exhibition, and then we'll get into the awards.
Thank you for the introduction, Amani. Well, it was a pleasure to jury this exhibition. There were so many good works. There's limited space in a gallery, and I know it's sort of a cliche to hear that some had to be cut just because of the limitations of space, but it really was a competitive pool of entries, and then even more so when I had to narrow it down to finalists and award winners. So if you weren't one of those award winners, to just know that it is somewhat subjective, and I do my best to be objective, but I think a different juror in here might have picked a slightly different range. But anyways, just to comment on what high caliber work was in the exhibition, and it really was impressive. So I chose this work. I have some notes here, so I didn't forget anything. Read from them. So I chose this work because the thickly painted landscape sort of speaks to the landscape painter Tom Thompson, the Canadian Group of Seven. Like I was getting those vibes from it. Also a bit of Van Gogh landscape in terms of the texture and possibly the influences of French Impressionism, but also I can see a little bit of Expressionism in the way those clouds are painted, and how the patches of paint become abstract in that they're patches of paint, but then they also build up to read to space and volume and color and light and representation. For this one, I don't think anyone who's seen Philip Guston can look at this piece and not see that influence. So I don't know if this was an influence, but it certainly comes across strongly as speaking back to Guston, but also an artist in their own right, right? Not copying, but speaking to, pushing the language forward. What really grabbed me about this was the way that that sort of Pepto-Bismol pink moves through the center, kind of moving diagonally from mid right to upper left, and then you have the opposing diagonal in a slightly different pink going from lower left to upper right, and those all really hold together as a unit and kind of create both the foreground and a background for the painting. I also saw a little bit of Diebenkorn in here with the striping that becomes line but is also form, and the push-pull of the picture plane, which starts to talk about Hans Hofmann. You look at one area of this sort of pink mass in the center, and at some points it feels like it's sitting on the picture right at the edge of the picture plane, and other times it pushes back into space. I also was interested in the way the other colors moved us around, like this sort of chartreuse color that goes from the center of the painting down to these like almost radiator coils in the lower right. And then also the way the reds move us up from middle of the bottom of the page and kind of arc us around to the top. Anyway, it's just a really solid piece. And I think it's actually harder to paint abstractly than representationally and make it work. So bravo. So this one, I was really impressed with. First of all, I looked at the size and I'm like, yay, right? It's massive. Like I want to see this in person because I feel like this is one of the ones where size does matter, where you walk up and 60 inches long, that piece is going to envelop us. We're going to have to turn our head to see both sides. And anyway, I thought that was kind of exciting. And I like the way that, although this is very representational, very, tied to realism, the abstraction in it, the underlying abstraction is what holds it together for me. So, I feel like you could divide this into quadrants, right? Right down the center vertically and right down the center horizontally. And we look in that lower left-hand quadrant, we get this sort of saturated or vivid blue. And it starts to talk to that saturated or vivid yellow and orange in the upper right-hand corner, right? And I like the way that saturation kind of moves diagonally. The other two quadrants, like upper left and lower right, the color becomes desaturated and a little more neutralized, and those are quieter. Those are quieter. So we get this very fast, strong diagonal movement with the saturation. We get the long horizontal of the format of the piece, right? So we get that movement. And then we have all these, assuming cypress trees, because it says cypress swamp, right? All these verticals going through this horizontal as the opposing movement, opposing angle, and kind of slows down that movement horizontally across the painting. When I look at it, I almost feel like it's like some kind of jazz syncopation, right? There's a lot of beats that come in right before and right after the 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's just like it's a little bit syncopated and with some surprise rhythm in there, but it's all sitting on a more structured base. So anybody who's into music maybe can kind of get that. The other thing that I really liked about this one, again, beyond representation, because it beautifully represents that space. Again, I really think this is one we have to get in front of, but it shows that space, that light, that color, that's all there. But I like how not only is it divided sort of vertically, with that little the bottom middle, you get that little bit of orange leaves kind of divide it, and then across horizontally with the horizon line. So, you go into quadrants and halves and things, but then there are these groups of trees on the right-hand side, a little bit above center, and all the perspective leads us back to that point. All right. So it's like this little focal point that's a little bit off center, a little bit off rhythm, just enough that it sits in the structure, but it's a nice surprise and everything kind of swirls around that moment. So first things first, I think technically that this painting is quite impressive. You look at it and it appears to be a little tiny painting. You start to look at the size, you're like, this isn't a little tiny painting, especially not for watercolor. And not that things have to be big, but that kind of surprised me when I was viewing these. And I think the technical ability with this is just stellar. The forethought that has to go in with watercolor before you have to think before you mark, that like oil. It's like you can, you know, I mostly paint in oils. It's like you can do anything to that canvas and you can get it right back to where you need it to go. Watercolor is like sort of premeditated. And I just thought that was impressive. On top of that, I think the color sensibility is quite beautiful. I mean, just taking this upper right hand corner with the cloth with the blue diamond pattern. Like as we go through the shadow in that cloth, we pick up the red reflected light from the striped cloth. Then we start to pick up a violet blue light from the environment. And then we start to get a little bit of a green light or a green color to the shadow that's getting this reflected light, I'm assuming from the glass container. That takes a lot of rigorous looking. And that's what I see in here. I see when a plane turns, a temperature turns, but not only does that happen, there's also a really clear evidence of just looking at all this reflected light bouncing around within the setup. It's quite beautiful. The other thing that was surprising is I'm like, this composition shouldn't work, but it does. That would that those cherries and striped cloth in the upper left-hand corner. I assume they're cherries. I don't know, but that should unbalance the piece, right? When you put an anomaly like that in terms of color and form on an edge, it creates a lot of visual weight, and it's hard to come back from that. It's hard to rebalance your piece. But when we get to this, it's interesting. When we get to that glass piece, the artist has balanced it with detail and contrast. So, in contrast in terms of value. Yes, I thought that was a really interesting and clever way to resolve the work. So, when I do these, I figure out what I want to talk about with each of these. I go by gut feeling first, and then I come through and I analyze as I'm choosing them. And then when we go back, to write comments, I'm doing the same thing again. Like, what was my gut feeling? You know, let's say analysis of this. I'm often doing it at the dining room table, and my kids are running back and forth, and my husband, and they'll see something and they go, "Ooh," and then they'll make a little comment and keep going on their way. And so my husband walked by and he's like, "Oh, that's nice. That's so peaceful." And I agree, right? And I'm like, and it got me thinking, like, why is it peaceful? I mean, other than the subject matter, right? Other than the subject matter, why is it peaceful? I'm looking and thinking because things are going on a rhythm that are expected. They're big shapes, big forms, and it almost started making me think of like Japanese woodblock prints of like landscapes, that big heavy black that interrupts that form and the landscapes, and then also these like flat planes of color that end up building up into form in a way that you wouldn't expect, right? Like you see Degas, Vouillard, and George O'Keeffe, not George O'Keeffe, why am I saying that? Mary Cassatt, using those later in their work, right? They find that flattened color shape relationship. But this is happening in a photograph, right? So to get that to happen in the photograph, I think is even more tricky. I love the way the bottom shape of the shadow starts to mimic the shape and angle of the boat, right? Even the stripes and whatever's happening in that shadow start to mimic the seats in the boat. It's like a 1-2 and a 1-2. The oar that's moving diagonally from lower left to upper right, we get a stripe down at the bottom that moves from upper left to lower right. And too much similarity, too much of expected form gets a little boring. And so I love that little ripple just in the lower left-hand corner, and the irregularity of the sides, and the little bits of yellow at the top that just kind of gives us that little bit of unexpected color and shape and form, make it exciting. You know, it, I'm really attracted to abstraction, and anytime we can find something that there's representation there, but there's also abstraction, and that precipice where it sort of vibrates between the two, and you start to get some ambiguity in the representation. You also start to get some ambiguity in the abstraction. I think that's a really interesting line to walk. And I felt like in these and the other photographs by this artist did that, walk that line really carefully and really brilliantly. I love that this is a facade of a building, and we know that, but we can't see in, right? So if we take like content into it, we can't see in, but the whole world's reflected back out at us. And so we're getting like the reflection of the world by trying to look in somewhere. We're trying to look inside, but we're seeing outside. So I like that sort of conceptual idea. And I like the regularity of the pattern. It's like a rhythm that's monotonous, and then you get surprise, right? You get surprise in that lower corner. You get surprise in the way the colors move through, where it's like that complementary contrast with the bright orange and the bright blue, all surrounded by these neutrals of gray and black. So, when I first saw this, I was like, ooh, I like this. She's sassy. There's a little psychology to the sitter, eh, that made me want to come back and look. It's like the sitter feels like they're interacting with the viewer. It's not just a portrait. It's not just representation of the sitter. There's an interaction and a psychology, the way the head's being held, the three-quarter glance back at the viewer, and that the sitter's looking through sunglasses, which gives us sort of a veil between accessing that the protagonist in the painting, right? I feel like there's a little narrative here. When I looked at this, I immediately thought of painters who work more tonally and kind of focus more on local color. So I was thinking about like Philip Pearlstein, Amy Sherald, Alex Katz, all of whom seem to find like there's color in this and there's color when you change the value, but the color range of say on the hat, right, the color range where we go from into the light to into the middle value to into the shadow is more tonal than color led. And so I'm thinking about people like this, portrait artists like this who tend to do this, and that's working on top of a really good tradition, right? There's a lot of sort of like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And then abstractly, because there's always the abstract element, that the underlying element that holds things together. I really like the whimsy of the hat, the gesture of the hat, right? Beyond just being a hat, like that gesture and flow across and around the head, and how the darks in the hat start to become, almost repeat the sort of arabesque shapes of the hair. I also, wasn't lost in the fact that the circle glasses and the circle earrings, that having that repetition again, the circle, although wavy of the hat, and so on. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, again, like standing on the shoulders of giants, like that sort of more tonal local color portrait, that tradition of portrait painting, but also maybe like 17th century Dutch painters, or someone like Frans Hals, who always had a black and a white near the flesh tone. And actually tell my students to do this. Like put a black and put a white next to the flesh tone, because that keys your flesh tone tonally, right? You know where your flesh tone is going to sit in between those things. So that's kind of speaking back to that Dutch tradition too. So another portrait equally as brilliant as the last, but for different reasons, right? So the figure is engaging with the viewer, which is interesting, and that gives it that gives it a different kind of psychology than if they're not. And this one feels more of the French tradition, where the local color isn't as dominant, where there's a lot more sort of colored changes as we move through the flesh. And with this one, what I liked is the transparency of the flesh. Like the artist was able to get that transparency of flesh, how what happens when the light hits the flesh and it becomes opaque and bounces off, and what happens when we start to see light filter through flesh and it starts to glow. I think that was really brilliant. And also, again, like talking, speaking to the French here, the French, impressionists here, but the sensitivity to edge, the sensitivity to edge, where the soft edge allows us to really go around the form. The form becomes volumetric, and the hard edge tends to stop our eye and catch our eye. And again, I mean, I really zoomed in on these to see what was going on. So again, I think this would translate much better in person. But yes, extremely beautiful portrait. So this one, I looked at it and I was struck by the image, and I went through and looked at a bunch more, and I came back, I was struck again, and went through and looked, I looked when I was during the show, I looked through all of the images, and I was like, what is it that I like about this? I gotta like, there's something, and I have to like sit down and kind of suss it out. So I think there's somewhat of a timelessness about this image. Like, I'm not sure if it was photographed. I mean, I can tell by the faucet, but other than that, I'm not sure if it was photographed in 1969 or yesterday. there's sort of this timelessness, I think, with oh, maybe whatever filters on or the coloration. Also the model, sort of has a rather kind of timeless hairstyle or look about them. And I like that about it. I like that I was a little confused. I also thought it was really well composed. So I like the arc, that the spatial arc that's made with three heads. Like we're really on the left side where the head is right up against the picture plane, and then we immediately move back to the center figure and then around to the figure on the right. And then it keeps creating this sort of circular movement, but the viewer's involved. Because when we get to the third figure, or the figure that's on the left hand or the right hand side rather, the figure's looking back at us. And so we're like the fourth person in the room, or the second one if you don't want to count the reflections as other figures, right? So I like that interaction, that are we voyeur? Are we looking over? Are we communicating with the figure? And it's like the figures in between expressions. So that's kind of it keeps some tension on it. I also like how the mirrors become frames, and then the edge of the photograph becomes a frame. The repetition of striping through, we have the stripes on the wall, the stripes of the vertical edges of the mirror frames, the stripe of the door frame in the back, the stripe of the bikini tan, that it just keeps repeating throughout the whole um, image. This is our last one, and last but not least, for sure. I was really struck by this one as well. I mean, struck by all of these. All these works are so amazing. Um, but I love this photograph for a bunch of reasons, but one, composition and color, right? So the way that those pylons, the perspective pulls us back to the focal point, which are those two grayish shacks, right? And then we go up top, and the perspective of the clouds pulls us back to those two shacks. And then we start to look at the shacks and we realize, okay, they group in as a unit, as a form, because of proximity, because of similarity, because of, all of the principles of art that tend to want to unify things. And then we start to notice up on the upper right-hand side, sort of a third and fourth structure, and they start to speak to it. They start to speak to those two buildings in the center. We can sort of get this movement from lower right or from upper right to middle, and then from middle over to the other landmass on the left side with the boats and houses and such, which all group together and become like supporting actors in a play. Like those two shacks in the middle are like the main character, and these other little pieces and parts are like the supporting cast. I like the way the landmass, if you follow it from the upper right with the roofs that are being cut off by the edge of the composition, and you keep following it over, it sort of lines up perfectly with that dark stripe and the landmass on the left. And if you keep going, that just skims across the top of a boat, the some I don't know what the sailing term is, maybe the mast. There's a horizontal line, and it comes over and it skims the top of the other boat. And it's just like you could almost do this in every part of this composition. You could take a line and continue it, and it starts to connect and line up with other angles and verticals and horizontals. Really creates this sort of invisible grid that holds the piece together. So that was our last one, and I'm happy to expand or answer any questions.
No, I just want to thank you for your wonderful comments. I don't think I even wrote a statement that thorough, and your observations are very much appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for your wonderful art.
Ms. Thorpe says very thoughtful critique. I agree. It was very insightful and well thought through. I don't think anyone has questions, so I just want to formally thank you on behalf of the MFA for being such a pleasure to work with and for joining our show.
Well,
Um,
same to you. Thanks.
yeah,
You're a pleasure to work with too.
thank you. It was evident that you really put a lot of thought and time into your decisions, and like Ms. Thorpe said, very insightful and thoughtful critique. So honestly, thank you so much. We hope that you will work with us again one day. To all the artists that joined, thank you all for taking your time.
Seriously amazing work. I mean, really great. It was a pleasure to look through it and think about it. Thank you for sharing it with me.
Thank you everyone for coming. That concludes our virtual award ceremony. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. It is beautiful and sunny outside, so get out there and get some sun and some fresh air. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.